that has been seared into our collective consciousness in recent years are the images of refugees making a treacherous voyage by land or sea to attempt to reach a safe haven in Europe or beyond from the violence in the Middle East and parts of Africa. Of all the images, one of the most vivid and memorable was that of a young child who drowned in the Mediterranean and whose lifeless body washed up on the Greek coast. This single death captured the horror of the refugee crisis and galvanized the world's attention. This picture and countless images like it evoked a response from people around the world, including this community. The responses of some were positive, encouraging folks to find ways to help the refugees, including their resettlement. Others responded in fear, raising concerns that amongst these folks fleeing from war would be terrorists bent on the destruction of the homeland, whether in Europe or here in the United States. While many called for help and support for the refugees, others called for their rejection, in some instances refusing them entry altogether. Some were motivated by compassion, others by hatred, others by pity, but they were all emotional responses. Now, even for those who responded positively to the plight of the refugees, there was, as we shall see, a level of ambiguity in their response. Our reading this morning captures a conversation between two of the characters from Louis Penny's murder mystery, The Cruelest Month, Inspector Armand Gamache and Murner, the owner of the bookstore in Three Pines, Quebec. Gamache is investigating the mysterious death during an Easter seance of an older woman living in the village. Myrna, who was a psychotherapist before coming to Three Pines, is explaining to Gamache a concept from Buddhist psychology referred to as the near enemy. She describes it succinctly as follows. It's a psychological concept. Two emotions that look the same but are actually the opposites. The one parades as the other, is mistaken for the other. But one is healthy, the other is sick and twisted. Blogger Ethan Nichtern offers another description of the near-enemy concept as follows. He writes, one of my favorite ideas from Buddhist psychology has always been the near enemy. The idea of the near enemy is that for every beneficial habit or more enlightened quality that we may develop, in our mind, there is a devious and highly intelligent version of confusion which tries to masquerade very closely as the positive trait. Neil Berkman contrasts the related concepts of the far enemy and the near enemy. Yet one of the most insightful bits of Buddhist psychology, he writes, has been to reach a widespread modern audience, the notion of the near enemy. According to this way of thinking, for every desirable habit or state of mind, there's a far enemy, which is the obvious antithesis. Thus, hatred, it wouldn't surprise you to learn, is the far enemy of love, which is its obvious antithesis. Thus, hatred wouldn't surprise. Near enemies, on the other hand, are much sneakier and harder to spot because they so closely resemble the thing they're the enemy of. Needy, possessive codependency can look and feel a lot like love when it corrodes it. The concept of the near enemy can help us understand the impact of our true, if unstated, and perhaps misunderstood motivations in our interaction with others. Let's take the example of the European refugee crisis. Many of us believe that our response to the refugees' plight was motivated by feelings of compassion for their suffering. Yet Buddhist writer Jen Kornfeld cautions that our compassion may really be masking the more insidious emotion of pity. Kornfeld writes that the near enemy of compassion is pity. Instead of feeling the openness of compassion, pity says, oh, that poor person. I feel really sorry for people like that. Pity sees them as different from ourselves. It sets up a separation between ourselves and others, a sense of distance and remoteness from the suffering of others that is affirming and gratifying to the self. Compassion, on the other hand, recognizes the suffering of another as a reflection of our own pain. I understand this. I suffered the same way. It is empathic, a mutual connection with the pain and sorrow of life. Compassion is shared suffering. This near enemy of pity adversely affects our interpersonal relations with those who are the objects of our pity. Pity, according to Miles Neal, keeps people at a distance or degrades them to inferior positions. Buddhist literature reveals other pairings of a virtue and its near enemy. For example, loving kindness versus attached love. This contradiction can be found in dysfunctional romantic relationships based on codependence or lust and desire. Sometimes this is based on conditional love or affection with strings attached. As long as we're getting what we want from the relationship, things are fine. However, when we are no longer benefiting, the relationship falters. Sympathetic joy versus selfish exuberance. Sympathetic joy finds happiness from seeing the joy of others. The near enemy is self-exuberance, the manic quality of clinging to something that makes us happy in the moment. While it masks the taking pleasure in another's accomplishment, the attitude is really focused on how it makes us feel, not the joy of the other. Equanimity versus indifference. Equanimity is defined as the ability to dwell equally with pleasure and pain, with loss and gain, with praise and blame. Its near enemy is indifference, where we are detached from the way things are and really don't care. Louise Penny writes, so equanimity is balance. When something overwhelming happens in our lives, we feel it, but we also have the ability to overcome it. We might feel huge grief or sorrow, but deep down inside, people find a core. That's equanimity. But she goes on to explain, indifference is stoicism, a calm in crisis without feeling. They don't feel pain because they really don't care. People with equanimity can absorb a pain, feel it fully, and let it go. But they might look exactly like people who don't care at all. But who is really brave and who is the near enemy? Essentially, the notion of the near enemy allows us to confuse a genuine virtue with a synthetic or false one. For example, Ike Nichtern argues that recycling might be the near enemy of true environmentalism. He suggests that the plastics industry has taken up the mantle of recycling to avoid a more serious engagement with the question of how we might change societal behavior to adopt more sustainable practices. For example, the use of reusable containers rather than try to create more plastic out of recycled materials. In other words, to reuse rather than recycle. Oliver Burkeman suggests that near enemies can be found in spiritual practice as well. He writes that meditation can be a path to calm and clarity. But hang around meditators for a while and you're sure to run into a few who seem to be using meditation to smother issues they should probably see a therapist about. On closer inspection, what they exude isn't calm so much as an eerie sort of blankness. The American psychologist John Wellwood called this spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues. Not even the most apparently enlightened, it seems, are immune to confusing a fake for the real thing. All anyone can do is to be constantly aware of the risk. Coming to terms with the near enemy is, in the realm of Buddhist psychology, one step towards mental and spiritual health. In Buddhist meditation practice, this is an attempt to train the mind to overcome the problems raised by the near enemies, so we can express genuine love, genuine compassion, genuine equanimity towards others. One writer puts it this way: psychologically speaking, the mechanism involved in this training is known as reciprocal inhibition. In Sanskrit, this concept is called pratipaksha bhavanam, which means the cultivating of an opposing thought. The mind can only hold one thought or attitude at a time, so when one is generating love or friendliness, jealousy cannot arise. Each of the immeasurable thoughts counteract the other more harmful or disturbing ones. The four attitudes are antidotes for their opposite, and their near opposites referred to as the near enemies. When the afflictions that disturb the natural clarity of mind are removed, then pure awareness can abide in its own nature. Okay, so what does this mean in concrete, practical terms? Enough philosophizing here. I earlier mentioned the Syrian refugee crisis and the varying reactions to it in Europe and the United States. In examining these responses, we have seen the contrast between the response of compassion and its near enemy, pity. I'm sure all of us, consciously or unconsciously, have had both reactions to this seemingly insurmountable horror. Dr. Niels suggests that the best way to avoid having pity be the central driver of our response is to avoid becoming sentimental, overly emotional to the point that prevents benevolent activity. He goes on to suggest, practice compassion to those in distress. Our habitual reaction to strangers who are suffering may be disinterest or numbness, when we may feel great sadness and sympathy for those we love. So we've got to show this compassion not just for the ones that we're close to, but the ones that we're not, that we have no prior connection with. Disinterest keeps the heart closed and prevents us from experiencing our fundamental connection with others, while sympathy and sadness may render us useless to help those in need. Compassion involves an intuitive understanding that others are in pain, enough emotional detachment that protects us from being overwhelmed, and a strong desire to help alleviate the condition. The karmic result, remember karma earlier? The karmic result of the practices of compassion is to experience a world of unlimited care and support for all beings. The practice of upekkha, or equanimity, whose near enemy is indifference, is important given our current political polarization. Equanimity is the practice of seeing all things as kin and not holding some dear and others distance. The near enemy of equanimity is indifference, which can at first blush look like equanimity. What we have seen in the past few years, particularly in recent months, is a tendency to treat our opponents, or those who we disagree with, not as adversaries with different though valid points of view. Rather, they are seen as the enemy and the other, as objects for destruction. It is suggested that to reverse this tendency, we need to practice equanimity towards those that are unvirtuous. Our habitual reaction to those that act unfavorably is to criticize and condemn them. The moment we define others by their actions, we label them narrowly and cut ourselves off from the changing nature. Now we give them little chance to become neutral or even a loved one in our eyes. Cultivating a judgmental attitude also fosters a preoccupation with the flaws and limits of others, experiences, and ourselves. Rather than condemn the person, we condemn the afflictions that overcome our minds, and we try our best to stay connected and help them transform. The karmic result of the practice of equanimity is a sense of universal kinship with all beings out of which collective responsibility and bodhicitta are naturally arise. This is from the writer Neil. This is just a small sampling of the questions and practices which arise when we become aware of their near enemy. As we become more aware of how this concept applies to our relationships with others, the more we will be able to find ways to relate more fully and authentically with those around us. But what is important is that we be mindful of when our actions are driven by a healthy, loving precept, such as compassion, and when they drift over into pity, which poisons our relationships. Only when we are aware of the difference can we seek to modify our thoughts and behaviors towards a more fruitful path. Roger Nolan admonishes us, in your practice and your daily life, be on the lookout for the enemies both near and far. They can take subtle forms, but if there's a hint of clinging and aversion, you can be sure they are present. Any thoughts?